Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Art and America Society, we are delighted to welcome you tonight to Earth and Cosmos panel conversation and video screening. We are honored to feature Beatriz Cortez and Rafa Esparza in conversation with Carin Kuoni, Senior Director and Chief Curator at the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School, and Rachel Remick, Curator Assistant at the Museum of Modern Art, and former curatorial assistant here at America Society, and the person who initially proposed this exhibition. The discussion will be introduced by Aimé Iglesias Lukin, Director and Chief Curator of Art at America Society. We would like to thank the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School, especially to Carin Kuoni for partnering with us on this program, and to Eriola Pira, Curator and Director of Programs at the Center, for her support in organizing tonight's event. The presentation of Beatriz Cortez and Rafa Esparza, Earth and Cosmos, is made possible by support from Jana Krupp, as well as by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and the New York State Council of the Arts, with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature. The presentation of Cortez's work is supported in part by a Foundation for Contemporary Arts Emergency Grant. We thank Kibum Kim and everyone at Commonwealth Council whose contributions were essential to making this project possible. We would like to thank the Arts of America Circle for their ongoing support on our programming, and a special thank you to our speakers tonight, and to all of you for being here with us.
Vine al Ártico en busca de una partícula del volcán de Ilopango. No traje instrumentos científicos para encontrarla. Traje, eso sí, una idea que me enseñó la comunidad cachiquel de investigación de Cajay, que los objetos tienen vida, que tienen voluntad. Vine entonces convencida de que la partícula podrá encontrarme, de que va a reconocerme como uno de los suyos, de que va a decidir revelarse ante mí.
En el bajo mundo hay ríos de lava que fluyen bajo todos los volcanes. Cuando uno de nosotros hace erupción, estos ríos se convierten en piedras de lava, en obsidiana, en cenizas y en partículas.
Okay, thank you. Welding. You got it.
Me llaman el río Hudson, pero ese no es mi nombre. Mi nombre es otro. Soy el río que fluye en dos direcciones. En mi corriente se mezclan las aguas del mar y el agua fresca, y también el agua del río Mohawk. En este lugar se forman los remolinos sagrados.
Thank you again to Beatriz and Rafa, the true protagonists of this amazing evening. And I'm just going to introduce a little bit of on the exhibition and on working with them and how amazing it has been to do this event in friendship and in collaboration with the Vera List Center. which is very much in the spirit of what we're trying to do with this show. This exhibition is the first of a series in which we invite two artists that are friends with each other to collaborate, to jointly select a series of works and tell their own history. We really want to push artists to be able to tell their own art history before that is narrated and organized and told by art historians, art curators, and to really have, the possibility to hear from their own views. Also, on a personal level, was inspired by the many conversations that we hear artists have with each other in private settings or like in a party, in an opening, and sometimes you overhear them and you hear them talk about work through angles that those of us who are not practitioners maybe don't think about, like materials or or they talk about methods, or they talk about, things that maybe don't typically organize an exhibition. Exhibitions are typically organized by a theme or, chronology or, geography. And it has been amazing to see this happening, and the way that they have thought about this show has been so different from others. I hope I'm citing it well and they can expand on this, but they found this common topic or this common theme or trend in their work, which is to think about how objects travel through space and time, which is a very poetic concept. And if you go see the exhibition and maybe read the labels, or even if you don't read the labels, you will find that. And I think that's very beautiful. And they also travel through space and time to be here with us, which is a big effort. They come from LA. They did this show, I do want to highlight, the show was in Seoul in January, right after the fires in LA, and that was obviously something that really affected the way that the show was being built, and they were very generous to keep with the project. And it even ended up like being a tiny part of the installation in a way, in the way that the bricks and the dust from the bricks is being let hold in the space, which is something you're going to see, that there's a lot of dust in the floor, and that's also part of that trace of that soil that came from LA to be part of this exhibition and to compose the floor of this exhibition. So I just wanted to say highlight those things, and hope that you get a chance to see the show for the first time or again after we finish the talk. There's going to be also a reception, and please come celebrate with us. And also to try to highlight the affect that has driven their relationship and their collaborations and their work. And hope that that's something that keeps guiding the way that we think about art in these very challenging and difficult times. So I'm going to pass the word to Carin now, please.
Thank you very much. I have to say it's an absolute gift to be here and to be in conversation with you, Aimé, and also Rachel. And I just want to thank you, the Art at America Society, for partnering with us and bringing a 3-year project to such a spectacular conclusion. So thank you very, very much. There are lots of other people I'd like to thank, but maybe we'll do that later. You put it very nicely that this is a unique opportunity to hear from the artists and their relationship, and to see an exhibition that was curated really by the artists. So I don't want to take too much time, but as an institutional voice, but I do want to just acknowledge the relationships that are necessary to bring something like this into being. And as I reflected on the project, Beatriz Cortez, you were appointed, I think, 3 years ago as a Borderlands Vera List Center Fellow, which means that for 2 years you worked with our team, and Ariola Pira is also here, the Director of Programs at the Vera List Center, developing a project that eventually would become accessible to the public, visible in some form or shape. It's a fairly competitive fellowship. In hundreds of applications, we selected Beatriz and then held our breath really not quite knowing where you would take this project, but of course trusting you 100%. So the project that you applied with is called Ilopango, the volcano that left. And I thought it was so interesting that in this little video excerpt, you speak about your seeking the particles from the volcano that erupted. It's a historically documented volcano eruption in the 5th century in what is now El Salvador and was not called El Salvador in the 5th century. But you now seeking the particles of that volcano. In other words, the volcano has left, has taken off, and you seek it, and you are convinced that the volcano will find you. And similarly, what was historically left by the eruption of the volcano was the Tierra Blanca Joven. I don't speak a word of Spanish, but again, in the film, it was fascinating that there are 3 characters. The first is you describing your journey. The second one is the volcano who speaks as I. And then soon enough, we see an image of, or a sequence of a man covered in what looks like ash, white ash. His shoes are white, yours were black, and we see this white landscape. So what's left, what the volcano finds in the film 3 years after your initial idea is exactly this Tierra Blanca Joven. In the 3 years in between, there were, as I mentioned, lots of other partners and collaborations, and it's maybe just worth mentioning the Calder Atelier in France, where the actual volcano was built. There is Storm King Art Center up the Hudson River, where the volcano was presented. There is MPAC, which is at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute across the river from Storm King, I believe it's on the other side, where the volcano was also shown with a sound component. The boat you saw is the John J. Harvey, which is a historical fireboat that circulates Manhattan at times. And I'm sure I'm forgetting other organizational partners, but... Sorry? Yeah, of course, yes. Just to give you a sense, and before we hear from you two about the collaboration, how important these institutional partnerships are, and also how very personal they are. And not that I'm an artist, but it's lovely to have relationships like we enjoyed with you and the American Society. So with that, please, I think Rachel, you're next. Is that right?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to join this panel. I have known about y'all's work for many years now, and in looking over my notes for this talk, I realized that actually the first time I saw your work was a collaborative piece, Nomad 13, in Riverside, way back in 2017. So, in the spirit of conversation, I'd love to just kick things off with a question of, how y'all met, where did those seeds for collaboration first get planted, and how did that come to be? And then would love to, of course, dive into these films that we just had the chance to watch all together. But if we want to start there, if that feels generative, we can. So, yeah.
Sure. We met at a symposium at the Getty Center. Was it 2012 or 2013? Maybe a little bit later.
14 or 15.
It was a symposium that the Getty Pacific Standard Time Initiative kind of like put together in response to actually like a lot of critique. Artists that were kind of like critiquing like how centralized the initiative was kind of like coming together. And so they put together this 2-part symposium. One of them was hosted in San Diego. I forget the name of the space that hosted it there. And then the second part was in Los Angeles. And I had just like befriended you on social media maybe 2 days before that same week. And I remember they were looking for you. And I went to go find you, and Beatriz was yelling at me. She was like, why doesn't it?
I remember saying, why did they invite me if they don't know who I am? And Rafa laughing. That's how I met you.
Anyway, that's how we met. But we got to hear each other kind of like speak about our respective practices, along with like several other artists. I got to present, maybe I think it was like a 10-minute presentation of the work, and I remained, and I immediately just felt like the way that you were speaking to your practice and some of the ideas that you were materializing through your practice, it just felt like, I don't know, like there was something very obviously like new and intriguing, but also something very familiar. And yeah, hoped for an opportunity where we could work together in the future.
I think I just can add that I met Rafa that day, and I heard him speak, and I thought that what he was saying about immigration and the way he was speaking about in a way that was not positioned as nationalistic, the way that he spoke about art and about his family and about the future and what we can build, and his charisma and the way he laughed and how beautiful he is inside and out. And I thought, I want him in my life, and that was it.
Thank you. Do you remember the first work you made together, or what you might consider the first work you collaborated on?
It was Nomad 13.
It was okay.
It was amazing because we talked about it. That was one work that we didn't make by text. Usually we make our works by text because that's how young people communicate, so I have to accept that. But I think that what was amazing for me was that we talked about it, and then we said, see you there. And Rafa came with there was a hammer, and the dog Xolotl, and all the adobe bricks, and the smell of the adobe bricks was amazing, and I came with the steel components and
In a garden.
And I remember the first and the second time I made such a complicated puzzle that I couldn't put it together.
You're using Roman numerals and Mayan numbers.
I forgot to label it and then take note of how I labeled it. So I said, it's very easy. I put Mayan numerals where the Mayan numerals go, and then Roman numerals where the Roman numerals go, and then I couldn't understand it myself, and so Rafa had to put it together. But it still is like that, Nomad 13. We need to call Rafa to put it together, but now we have an installation manual.
But when our works, I feel like there's still a bit of that as the evolution of how we work together has happened. There's always still like a component of like not knowing or improvising. One of the works in the show came about in that way, producing a lot of maybe anxiety and nervousness for for American societies. But I feel like it's our way of maybe keeping the conversations alive, but also being able to kind of like respond to like what we're making in real time, and allowing ourselves a permission to do that.
Yeah, it makes installation day really exciting because we know and we imagine what the work will look like, but we have never seen it ourselves with all of its components. And then that day, everything comes together, and it's very easy for our works to come together because we have very similar ideas about certain things. So there's like this moment where my practice and Rafa's practice intercept at that moment. And then in that space, it's very easy for us. We don't usually argue, and we're both very giving and supportive of each other because we agree with each other about those things. And it's very beautiful for us to see that moment when it happens. So I love to collaborate with Rafa because of that. It's exciting.
I would love if you share a little bit. It's interesting because in the show, down in the show, there are no showing pieces, right? But I wanted to ask you, I remember you said something when we were having one of the first conversations to think about the show. Beatriz said something very beautiful, and she said that she didn't want a distinction between the pieces that were jointly signed officially and the ones that were done by each of them, because that was a distinction that had to do with labels and with the way in which we had to catalog the works and other issues, and that in their mind everything was collaboration because of the many conversations that they had by text. And you also talked about like being in touch by text or over the phone. And I wanted to ask you both, what does it mean in terms, you're obviously like trying to also challenge ideas of authorships and ideas of ownership, and how does that play along, in the way that you work?
Well, I think that there's an entire practice of Rafa's and an entire practice of mine that are separate, but when we are collaborating, which sometimes happens by conversation or by text, there's a moment when we're making a work and we know that this work is a result of a conversation. And one time, Rafa sent me a note saying, "We made a piece," and I said, "Really?" "Yes, and it's on view at," I forgot where it was on view. Where was it on view?
At our place in San Antonio.
In San Antonio. And send me a picture, and he sent me a picture, and I understood why that piece, Rafa thought it was a result of our conversations, but he didn't have to label the piece as a collaboration, but he did, and I think many times it has happened like that when we say, let's do this, it's because we have talked so much about so many of these things. So
there's also something about, I think in both of our practices, there are intentions to unsettle or to disrupt or rescue like some objects from a particular framing that feels like it's restrictive and doesn't allow like a more expansive experience of places, objects, architectures, peoples. And so I feel like, now over the years, I think that if we look at maybe the show, there are objects that you could recognize as being like made by Beatriz or made by myself, but I feel like we don't want to kind of like fall into this kind of like trapping of that authoring something sometimes produces. And so if I feel like maybe like the piece that we were talking about that feels like almost ceremonial is maybe like a good example of that.
what happens is that my place burned down and I was really depressed, and Rafa came over and he didn't say anything. He just said, "I don't have anything to do," which is never true. And I said, "That's not true. You have lots of things to do and you haven't rested." No, I really don't have anything to do. I'm going to work here today." "Really?" "Yes, I'm going to work here today." The next day he showed up again. "I'm going to still work here today." I'm like, "Really, Rafa, you should go rest." No, I'm going to be here until you feel better." And he stayed, and during the time he was there, we would talk about these objects and talk about these objects. And so eventually we realized that that was a piece, because that was a way to speak of the absence of the objects that were looted and that we can only have access to them through a 3D print, and that the color that they have allow us to see that one of the heads in the exhibition is a 3D print. It gives us this hint, and also that placing them there honors these plastic versions of the absent objects and becomes almost ceremony. And I loved the title, it's so poetic and beautiful. And so this whole thing happened almost automatically because we were together. And that's what happens when we're together, we talk, and eventually something ends up becoming a work. It's very beautiful.
In the photo, it's the third piece to the right.
Casi ceremonia.
And also, just a detail to contextualize the audience in case you missed the amazing opening. It was a very special opening because we had a ceremony for the altar. What you see in green, those little like things in the floor, are pine trees, which are part of the welcoming ceremony for the altar. And there was a similar ceremony which was done in this room during the opening to welcome the flag done by the Kashai Collective, which was, an invitation of Beatriz, and it was this beautiful, extra layer of collaborations that was included into the programming while they are here. Beatriz like suggesting for us to have the flag be done by the Kashai Collective, and I urge you to see the flag before you leave. The flag is a beautiful map to return home. For migrants to take, and it's a beautiful piece, and it's like embroidered on a lienzo. There it is. Good, thank you, Carla. Genius. But yeah, I wanted to highlight, it's not only between them, because it's not just because they like each other. They really are encouraging collaboration. In many multiple layers and through many multiple connections all the time.
You have invited me to talk about institutions or institutional collaboration, so I'd love to ask you another question about these very, very distinct entities that you brought together, and I listed them, but I'm particularly interested in this space here, the America Society, which I gather, I looked it up on Wikipedia, goes back to 1965 and was also an economic and cultural initiative to tie all the countries in the Western Hemisphere together, from Canada down to, I guess, Argentina or Tierra del Fuego. So you have that project, which is one, arising after the Second World War and really positioning the US as an imperial economic power. And then in the conversation that is captured in this beautiful, beautiful book, you speak of the Olmec head, and I gather one or several were presented in 1964 here in New York at the World's Fair out in Queens. Then you have Rensselaer Institute of Technology, private university, New School is a private university. You have this wonderful collective you just mentioned. So I'm curious to what extent you are interested and making very specific decisions about institutional collaborations. And I'm also asking that question because in this current political climate, I think we're all struggling to identify and define the resources that we as institutions develop differently, or rather not just in terms of federal funding. And if you could maybe comment on that a bit, what kind of institutions and what kind of resources are helpful for your collaborative practice, since this is the topic of the night?
I feel like finding people within these institutions that are maybe not only like supportive of ideas that we're working with, but also kind of like aligned with an approach, or with again some questions that we're undertaking in our practice feels very vital to working with institutions, because I think it's like a very kind of like it can be a very delicate journey to make work that's maybe like critical of an institution's like funding sources, its histories of exclusion, but also recognizing that kind of like how these institutions exist now, who's working inside of these institutions, and finding, I guess, like allies within these spaces to collaborate, and challenging, I think, like posing like questions that might posing questions that challenge like maybe like how certain protocols are taken up by folks that inherit these roles of maintaining some of the cultural spaces that we work in?
Yeah, I think that there is a certain way in which the art world that I'm familiar with in my daily life is very warm in Los Angeles, and artists are very generous and solidary with each other and show up for each other, and if you need them, they're there. And I think that institutions can have very complicated histories and can be entangled with histories, like you said, of colonialism and imperialism. And if we look at institutions, sometimes it's rare to find a team, like for example, the team here is a team mostly made of women who are highly intelligent, talented, and who make a great team. But that's very rare to find, and so I am really grateful for, like Rafa says, for the people who work in those institutions. They have to deal day to day with what it means to work in those institutions and to negotiate a space for an artist, and the support that they give us can make a huge difference in our careers. And for example, in my case, there were these three institutions, the MPAC, where Vic Brooks was thinking, yes, let's do that, let's have this volcano navigate the river, and Storm King, where Eric was making, Eric's back there in the back. I'm so glad that Eric's here. But Eric was putting together Eric's first show at Storm King, and I was so honored to be that first show that Eric curated there, and said, yes, let's do that. And the absence of the volcano, fine, that's amazing. Let's remove the volcano from this exhibition to send it to the other institution. I mean, people don't do those things. And the Vera List saying, yes, let's all collaborate with each other. And then now America Society saying that I think these institutions, because of the people that are in them, are behaving a little bit like the artists behave, and that makes me happy. It's great. It makes things possible without having sometimes the resources that, sometimes it's difficult to have.
Thank you. But, it's also thanks to you. I do want to say that Beatriz and Rafa are very convincing and insistent in the best way, and the results are out there. And yes, I mean, it's not all artists that generate the will and, and the space to think outside the box. On the contrary, it's typically, artists typically, they just want, to have more important people come, get more budget, have more space, bring more paintings, and you want to help when what you see is that they're trying to develop a good idea, and they're trying to develop a generative idea, a collaborative idea. But I don't know if you have any other questions, Rachel.
Sure, thank you. In one of the earlier answers y'all were giving, you brought up this idea of absence and presence, and those being themes in the work. And I think particularly in this show, I was curious to ask about these objects that you were speaking about that are kind of 3D printed replicas of historical artifacts that were looted from Central America, or in Rafa's case in hyperspace, kind of referencing these monumental Olmec stone heads, which then were traveled around the world at certain points in their history. But even in this photograph here in the central altar, how this altar, the artwork that we see downstairs, is a replica of an altar that exists in Guatemala. And so I was curious about this as kind of like a strategy in your work, and this idea of the replica or the copy as performing, having the trace of the original object, or performing a new history, or sort of refracting the original history, and how you were kind of thinking about that in developing the pieces for this show.
Well, I don't know if I would call it a replica per se, but But it is exactly what you're saying, that absence. For us, for example, this is a collaborative piece that Cajay, Fiebre Ediciones, and I made. And when we had these conversations, it was during 2020, in the year of the pandemic, and we would meet every Tuesday to think about this, which was amazing way to spend the pandemic. And one of the things that we talked about is that the stone altar, the government sent a crane to remove it and take it to the museum. And the way that people explain in Patricia is that the altar didn't want to leave and they couldn't move it. And so that, that idea that an altar can have the will and decide if it wants to go or not, and that you cannot force it, led us to think about whether or not, how can we change the language around the idea that there's immigrants that left, and so not to say whoever stayed did the right thing like the altar did, because that means that immigrants who left abandoned everything, but at the same time to fight for the land and the right to remain. That was really complicated, and so to do that, we decided that what could travel was the absence of the altar. What could travel was the altar, something that carried its spirituality and that carried the respect that it requires, just like the Casi Ceremonia pieces carry the respect because of the way in which we place them. This altar is placed in a way that it becomes Casi Ceremonia, and so it carries the absence of the altar and it carries the spirituality of the altar, but it is at the same time a work of art. And that complicated place is what we were interested in building.
And it's funny, we were walking over to get some coffee a little bit ago, and you were describing how there's like this affection when we, like in our text, when we refer to each other, and our love for collaborating and working together, but there's that same kind of like affection that we have for some of these objects that we're like referencing, pointing to. We use the terms like honor and respect, because I feel like those are modes that are operating against these more kind of like extractive modes that identify and name and categorize them. And I feel like those have been like really important ways of regarding like each other and our ideas and our works in the space. There's like literal like layering of objects that are kind of like materializing ideas. And they're not, and I agree with you that they're not like copies or replicas. In some instances, are like the absence is what's kind of like this, what's being invoked and generated, but there's also like abstraction that's happening. That's it. I just wanted to share like those, I guess, the way that we talk to each other about each other, our work, and how we kind of like regard these objects feels like they're not like words that are describing like how we feel about them. They're like words that, they're terms that are like generative.
And also, I feel really good that these objects are here at America Society, and that given the history of bringing, maybe without that same spirituality, other Olmec heads in 1965 for the World Fair, or given the history of colonialism and imperialism in the relationships of all the Americas, etc. There's a lienzo outside, like Aimé said, that has a map for the objects who are lost, who have been looted, or the humans that are lost to find their way home. And I feel that's really beautiful to have that then they don't feel lost in this space. They feel that like they are in a warm space, protected.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. It makes me think too how in the kind of layering, conceptual layering of the works too, the other thing they're making manifest is multiple temporalities or time periods, kind of blending the past and the present. And I know that's something that's been a point of interest in many of your collaborations. And in this show, like, how are you kind of envisioning some of that kind of refusal of linear time? Or I know, and I do want to get back to the videos because I know we all had the chance to watch this together, and I know you, Jennifer, for the Q&A when we open it up. And those themes also are pertinent to some of what's happening in those videos as well, but kind of bringing in that concept of invoking different temporalities, invoking these objects from the past or their present state in the museum, or the manifestation of their absence here in the show, like how you're thinking about that when you're working.
To me, they feel, it feels like time traveling. And it feels like that when we're having conversations. It feels like that, I think, when we're working on an exhibit or an installation, because of like the different temporalities that certain materials have that we're working with kind of like come together. And it never actually feels linear. I think there's always kind of like, there's simultaneity that feels like very palpable when we're like speaking about some of these objects and places, but also ideas. And I feel like it feels like palpable when we're kind of like walking through this exhibit.
I also think that the way we think of the Olmec, or we think of the Maya, on the one hand as our friends and collaborators, and on the other hand as our ancestors, but also still our interlocutors, forces us to collapse time, because they are here and they were here 2,900 years ago, and so there's this way in which they become current. And when Rafa says hyperspace, to me, it's another way to speak of hyperobjects, and the Olmecs worked with concepts like hyperobjects in their way that they imagine the underworld, or they imagine space, and for us now, how we imagine them crossing time. And so I think that our work in the material adobe has inside of it dormant seeds. It has different temporalities, and like Aimé said, the land of Los Angeles. So all those things are collapsing, not only time, but also space, because we can walk into the gallery space right now and see the land of Los Angeles, and we can imagine where that land came from, how it was mixed into the adobe, etc., but also how it was dispersed by many people who came to see the show and walked through it. And that dispersal erases time, and that's really interesting to me. And in our conversations with Rafa from the very beginning, I think one thing that was really fascinating for me was that none of us were nationalistic, in the sense that we're so interested in long temporalities that we love where we came from, but El Salvador or Mexico or the United States are only 200 years old. That's nothing compared to 2,900 years. And so we don't want to exist only in 200 years. And that those 200 years would potentially separate us and would potentially make us not get along.
That's beautiful. I do want to have you talk a little bit about the videos. And if you want to share, I mean, maybe Beatriz can start, because this is her first video and it's the first time she's sharing it. So thank you, Beatriz. And congrats.
Well, I'm going to start by saying something about Rafa's video, if that's okay. I want to say that I don't know, there's something really powerful. I don't know if you know that in the reflection of the windows, you see the men's prison in Los Angeles, and Rafa chirping away himself out of this concrete. It's at the same time a message about labor, about liberating ourselves, about the belief in our own strength, about so many things that became part of our conversations. That's really beautiful to see it in hindsight, because this performance was, I don't know if it happened maybe 10 years ago or so, and there's so many times when our communities during the marches, etc., for immigrant rights, we go to the men's prison and bring mariachis or a trio, and we sing by the prison, because so many people in our community have been imprisoned in those cells. And so having that performance there is so powerful, and what it means to have a performance like that in public space is so powerful. And in many ways, it enters in conversation with my work, seeing a volcano travel through the Hudson River. I can imagine, I don't know, a grandmother going out to have some lemonade outside and seeing a volcano go by. Or I don't know, at the Federal Lock #1, they said, no, you cannot come in here to film. And then the engineers went out to film. They all wanted to, everybody would stop and see, why is there a volcano going through here? So there's something really disruptive of the regular narrative that's there in daily space, that I think that's what establishes a conversation between our works.
Yeah, I feel like maybe viewing each video separately, I think would allow maybe like space to kind of like maybe consider the videos kind of like as standalone. And here we have, I feel lucky to get to experience seeing Bust next to your video, and so, but it kind of like allows for like a type of legibility, and to see maybe like some threads, or like how maybe the works speak to one another, or what are like maybe some maybe like some intersections in the work. I really enjoyed experiencing your video kind of like a codex, and really kind of rescuing it from the way that we experience like narrative, giving the river a voice, giving the volcano a voice. All of that felt like very like anthropomorphic for me. It was like witnessing like a mountain speak, and then the choices of like the river being like a young person was really exciting for me to see also. But then also like there are like other maybe like more explicit through lines, like the hammering of the metal, of like building the stones. I was thinking a lot about what you say in the beginning when you were looking, and all of this feels like very like intimate for me too. It doesn't feel like you starting to say that you were embarking on this journey to find particles of the volcano without like without any scientific tools, right? But your intuition, or maybe like a memory, the sense of like knowing, or of a familiarity with something, like you would recognize, or maybe those particles would recognize you once you like met. And so I like thinking about that also as kind of like a way of imagining like how the mountain comes together and travels through space.
Yeah, it was also an homage to Cajay, who they wrote in the Comunidad Cachiquel de Investigación a paper about ancient objects, and and they talk about objects being alive. And I thought, well, if objects are alive, then particles are alive, then volcanoes are alive, then our sculptures are alive. And from there, I began thinking about how important it was for me to go to the Arctic, because all my artist friends who were in the boat had so much technology with them, and it would sometimes seem as if I didn't come prepared, although I had my drones and I was, filming my footage, etc. But sometimes I would just go out to see what I would find, because that moment was so important. And also to have that sense of, I will never be here again, This moment will not happen again. And so that not needing scientific tools opens up the possibilities for other tools that I think our show also opens up. Downstairs.
I love you saying that, because I feel like the equipment that you were working with, or to take video, could I ask you like a question about like how this came together, like the video? Did you have someone to help you kind of like, I guess like shoot the different things that we see?
No, I mean, at the river, we had a huge team of ultra amazing, super talented people from the MPAC, but I shot most of the shots that you saw here, except for the drone shots of the volcano in the river. But in the Arctic, you cannot take anyone to the Arctic. So Philip Byrne from my studio would train me every day and would say, well, this is like riding a bike, you can do it. Let's go to Griffith Park and let's film Griffith Park, and just imagine it's an iceberg. But then when I went to the Arctic, I would fly my drone and go capture the iceberg, but I mean the glacier, and I forgot the boat drops ¿cómo se llama? An anchor, but it doesn't stay still. so the drone would come back, and then I would have to convince it to come back here. And sometimes the captain would be like, do you want me to go after your drone? If you're running out of battery, I can't go after the drone. And I was like, no, I can totally do this. But I was not very good at, doing it, and yet I did it the same way that I built my sculptures. I don't know how to build my sculptures each time. I have to figure it out. And I don't know how to make a film, and each time I have to figure it out. And I don't know how to do, and not knowing is important to me, and it's important to me not to have ACAD in my studio. It's important to me not even to consider this a film necessarily, or a video. And I remember I asked Vic, because Vic is a filmmaker, I asked her, well, how do I make a film? I want to make a film about all this. Just do it. And that's what she said. And I said, but how do I go about it? I think if you just get started, you will know. And that was her answer. And that was a really important answer, because Vic was believing in my ability to make a film. And so she convinced me that I should just start doing it. And I think that was important, because I didn't approach it as one would from the discipline of filmmaking. I approached it from my own conceptual beliefs. And I think that in the way in which we put together our show, or in the way that we collaborate, or the way we build our sculptures, etc., or your performances, they are based on our beliefs and not on the idea of performance or on the idea of sculpture. Those things are not so important to us, and I think that's really important.
No, I was asking because of how you said that you wanted to have an kind of like unmediated experience with the places that you were visiting, and I feel like sometimes like maybe some of these tools would have gotten in the way, and that's been like an intentional decision that I've made in not documenting some performance. And so like this video that we have thanks to our beautiful friend Dorian Wood, who's also a performance artist and musician, but she was present and had the impulse to kind of lift up their cell phone and video record that part of the performance. But I think there's something about kind of like building a relationship to space and to materials and having like an unmediated way of getting to know these places, as opposed to like having like all these like tools and methods that are literally intended to inform you of what you're seeing. Right?
Yeah, but I think one thing I learned from the experience of the river is that when the first day, because the second day I was on the boat, filming from the boat, but the first day, Vic, Eric, my team, and I, and Ryan, we were chasing the boat, and Ryan said, please don't go with me. And I was like, I wonder why he doesn't want us to go with him, but all his shots, which are beautiful, like that shot where the boat is going by and there's un silbato, there's a big horn. You can hear in the real video, you can hear Ryan going, because he would park, he would run and chase the boat, and he would run. And then he would take the shot, and then he would get in the car and run. And so he said, don't go with me, because we were gonna slow him down. And that was really funny, but there are other times when Eric, Vic, Tatiana, and I were running, chasing the boat on this side of the river, but somebody else was on the other side of the river, or from the drone, or from the boat. And so having these different perspectives was really interesting to me. But I think that it is important to be able to photograph it, be there yourself and experience. I remember the most important thing was to me when we got to the place where the rivers meet, and I had talked to some people in Troy who had told me that's where the bones of the ancestors are, where these waters meet, that's where a sacred place. And I remember thinking, wow, you know, the spirituality that you feel in this place. And at that moment, somebody approached me and said, could I interview you? And I was like, I can't talk right now. Because I was so overwhelmed by that moment. And I realized that not everyone could see it, that I could see something that other people didn't see at that moment was really interesting to me, because I was like, whoa, it was almost overwhelming. It's because you can see across time. And if you can't, you only see the water in front of you, and that's the difference.
Yeah, that is beautiful, and I'm in the terrible situation of having to say that we don't have more time. I could open for questions from the audience, but the problem is if I do that, we will not have a chance to have drinks together. And in honor of the collaborative and empathic spirit of this exhibition, I think we have to prioritize having a drink, cheering together. And you can ask them questions individually while we all have a drink and see the show. Yes, exactly. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody.